My mother always said there were two kinds of women in this world, the kind men want to protect and the kind men want to run away from. And for the first 28 years of my life, she made sure I believed I was the second kind. My name is Rachel Harper. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, and if you looked at our family photos on Facebook 3 years ago, you would think we were perfect. A sweet, middle-aged, church-going mother, a daughter newly married to a handsome lawyer, a quiet suburban house with a white porch and a Labrador sleeping in the afternoon sun. But the truth is, ever since I was little, I lived with the feeling that there was something wrong with me. Not because anyone hit me, not because I went hungry, but because every single day, my mother made me feel like I was unworthy of love. Some kinds of toxicity don't leave bruises on your skin. They leave something much deeper, a voice inside your head that follows you for the rest of your life. My earliest memory of my mother was when I was about 6 years old. My kindergarten class had a family drawing day. I drew my mom in a blue dress standing next to me, then proudly ran home to show her. She stared at the picture for a few seconds before laughing. Not a happy laugh, but the kind filled with disappointment. "Do I really look this fat?" she asked. I apologized immediately, even though I had no idea what I did wrong. Then she crumpled the drawing and threw it into the trash. She told me that if I wanted people to love me, I needed to learn how to make them happy first. I remember digging that drawing out of the trash later that night and smoothing it out under my blanket like I was trying to save something important. Looking back now, I think that's exactly how I treated my mother my entire life, trying to fix something that never wanted to be fixed. My father died when I was 10 years old after suffering a stroke in the garage while working on his car. My mother told everyone how devastated she was, how much she had sacrificed for the family. But the night after the funeral, she walked into my room, yanked the curtains open, and said, "Don't think you're the one suffering the most here." I still remember the smell of her perfume that night, sweet vanilla, a scent that made me nauseous for years afterward. After my father died, my mother turned me into her emotional dumping ground. I listened to her cry about money, about terrible men, about how she wasted her youth having me. One night she hugged me while sobbing and whispered, "If I didn't have you, I could have remarried someone richer." I was 13 years old. As I got older, I realized my mother competed with me. The first time a boy asked me to homecoming, she looked at the red dress I was wearing and said, "You know boys that age only want one thing, right?" I canceled the date that same night. When I earned a scholarship to college in Atlanta, my mother cried for 3 straight days and told me she would die alone if I left. I gave up the scholarship and stayed close to home. She hugged me afterward and called me the best daughter in the world. That was what she always did. She made love feel like a reward you only earned by sacrificing yourself. I met my husband Caleb when I was 24, inside a small used bookstore in Charleston. It was pouring rain outside, and I accidentally spilled an entire coffee on his shirt. Instead of getting angry, he laughed and said now he finally had an excuse to buy a new one. Caleb was the kind of man who made people feel safe just by standing near them. He spoke softly, loved Hemingway novels, and somehow remembered exactly what flavor ice cream I liked after hearing it once. The first thing my mother said when she met him was, "A handsome lawyer like you probably has better options than my daughter." I laughed awkwardly while Caleb quietly squeezed my hand under the table. Later, he admitted he sensed something was wrong with my mother the very first time they met. He said she looked at me like competition instead of a daughter. But back then, I didn't understand. When you grow up inside something twisted for long enough, twisted starts to feel normal. My mother slowly inserted herself into every part of our relationship. She called me at midnight asking where Caleb was. She constantly reminded me that attractive men always cheat. She told me stories about neighbors abandoned by their husbands after giving birth. One time, she even showed me Caleb's ex-girlfriend's Facebook profile and pointed out how much prettier she was than me. I cried in the bathroom for nearly an hour while Caleb sat outside the door, just repeating that he loved me. Looking back now, the scariest thing wasn't that my mother hurt me. It was that she made me incapable of believing genuine love could exist. Caleb proposed to me at the Charleston Harbor during the summer when I was 26. The sky was soft orange that evening, and somewhere in the distance a violinist was playing Somewhere Only We Know. When I called my mother to tell her, she went silent for a few seconds before asking, "Are you sure he's serious about you?" One sentence was enough to dim my happiness. After we got engaged, she became even more controlling. She changed our wedding venue because the one I chose wasn't classy enough. She criticized my wedding dress for showing too much shoulder. She even cried in front of relatives about how I was getting married too young and didn't know how to take care of myself. Caleb and I started arguing more because he wanted me to set boundaries with her, while I constantly felt guilty. We got married in November. In our wedding photos, I looked beautiful and happy. No one knew that the night before I sat crying on the kitchen floor because my mother told me Caleb would eventually grow tired of me, the same way my father supposedly got tired of her. During the reception, she gave a 10-minute speech about how difficult it had been raising me and how she had finally completed her responsibility. I saw Caleb clench his jaw, but he stayed silent. On our wedding night, instead of celebrating, I sat apologizing to my husband for my mother's behavior. Caleb stared at me for a long moment before quietly asking, "Do you realize you're always apologizing for other people's mistakes?" The first year of our marriage was genuinely happy. We bought a small house near the beach, adopted a cat named June, and drove to Savannah on weekends for seafood dinners. For the first time in my life, I started feeling normal. And that was exactly when my mother began losing control. She called every day, and if I missed a call, she would text things like, "I guess you don't need me anymore." One night, she drove over 3 hours just to show up at our house at 9 p.m. because I forgot to call her back. Caleb became seriously frustrated. He changed the locks after catching her inside our house while we were at work, rearranging our bedroom. When she found out, she cried like she had been betrayed and accused me of letting my husband destroy the bond between mother and daughter. I got pregnant during our second year of marriage. It should have been the happiest time of my life, but my mother turned it into a nightmare. She constantly told horror stories about women dying during childbirth, said I was too weak to become a mother, criticized my eating habits, and even warned Caleb that women become depressed and unattractive after giving birth. One night, I woke up at 2 a.m. and found her standing inside the unfinished nursery. She gently touched the crib and whispered, "Once a baby comes, men usually change." I didn't know why, but something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. Then things started becoming truly strange. Around my 6th month of pregnancy, Caleb began receiving anonymous phone calls late at night. The caller never spoke, only breathed softly before hanging up. Then emails started arriving at his law firm, accusing him of having an affair with an intern. The accusations were fake, but they still triggered an internal investigation that lasted weeks. Caleb assumed someone at work hated him, while I became so anxious I could barely sleep. One evening, while I was folding baby clothes, my mother casually said, "If Caleb ever leaves you, I hope you'll be strong enough to survive it." I asked her why she would say something like that. She just shrugged and replied, "I understand men." 2 weeks later, an envelope with no return address arrived at our house. Inside were photos of Caleb leaving a hotel with a dark-haired woman. The angle made them look intimate. My entire world spun. When I showed the pictures to my mother, she didn't even look surprised. She simply hugged me and whispered, "I was afraid of this all along." That night was the first truly terrible fight Caleb and I ever had. He insisted the woman was a client going through a divorce and that they met at the hotel because a legal conference was being held there. But by then, fear had already consumed me. Every horrible thing my mother ever told me came flooding back into my head. Men leave. You're not enough. Nobody could love you forever. Caleb slept on the couch that night, and the next morning I woke up to the sound of a phone ringing downstairs nonstop. When I walked down the stairs, I found my husband frozen in the middle of the living room, pale as if he had seen a ghost. On the TV behind him was a breaking news report about a deadly car accident that happened near his law office. And the car in the footage looked exactly like Caleb's. I remember the exact feeling of seeing that black Mercedes on the morning news. My stomach dropped instantly. On the screen were police officers, ambulances, flashing red and blue lights reflecting against rain-soaked pavement, and the front of the car was crushed so badly it was almost unrecognizable. The news anchor said a Charleston lawyer had been involved in a serious accident on his way to work. I turned toward Caleb and saw him staring at the TV like he couldn't process what he was seeing. He immediately ran outside to check the garage, and his car was still there, untouched, not a single scratch. We stood on the porch in the cold wind for almost 10 seconds without speaking. Then Caleb's phone rang. It was his colleague. Even from a few feet away, I could hear the man's voice shaking. "Caleb, someone was driving a car identical to yours, and he had a fake wallet with your name on it." My entire body went cold. Within hours, police officers arrived at our house. The man killed in the crash was believed to be in his 30s, but they couldn't identify him immediately because his face had been severely damaged. The most terrifying part was what they found in his jacket pocket: a fake driver's license with Caleb's name, a fake company ID, and even printed photos of me taken from my Facebook profile. One of the officers asked Caleb if he had enemies or recent conflicts with anyone. Caleb said no. I stood behind him the whole time, with only one thought repeating inside my head: this is not normal. Right after the police left, my mother called me. The strange thing was, she already knew about the accident before I told her anything. She sounded panicked on the phone, crying while asking if Caleb was okay, then insisting we leave Charleston for a few days. At the time, I didn't notice it, but later I realized her reaction sounded less like someone hearing shocking news for the first time, and more like someone who had been waiting for it. 2 days later, the police identified the dead man as Vincent Cole, a con artist with a history of insurance fraud and identity scams. But nobody understood why he was pretending to be Caleb, and nobody understood why he happened to be driving along Caleb's exact route to work that morning. For the first time, Caleb looked genuinely afraid. He installed security cameras around the house and told me not to stay alone. I tried to stay positive, but the feeling of dread kept growing every day. Then the woman from the hotel started haunting me again. I tried to forget those photos, but my mind had already been poisoned by my mother for too many years. Every time Caleb worked late, I imagined him with another woman. Every time his phone lit up with a message, my chest tightened. One evening while Caleb was in the shower, his phone lit up with a text from an unknown number that simply read, "Did you tell your wife yet?" I froze in the kitchen, and right at that moment, my mother walked in. I still remember the sound of her heels against the wooden floor. She looked at the phone screen, then looked at me with that familiar expression of pity. "I never wanted you to get hurt," she whispered. "But maybe you deserve to know the truth." I burst into tears right there in front of her. My mother wrapped her arms around me like she was the only person in the world on my side. Looking back now, that's the scariest thing about manipulative people. They stab you first, then hold you while you bleed, so you mistake them for safety. That night, I confronted Caleb. He practically lost his mind from being accused. He unlocked his phone, emails, work calendar, everything. The text message was from a female client going through a divorce who wanted to ask about paperwork. There was no affair, no secret relationship, but the fight still exploded. I screamed that I didn't know who I could trust anymore. Caleb stayed quiet for a long time before saying something that still hurts me even now. "Rachel, don't you see it? Your mother is teaching you to fear the person who loves you the most." I locked myself inside the bedroom. And that was the first night I heard someone standing outside my window. At first it was just soft rustling sounds from the backyard. I thought it was a stray cat, but then I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, moving around the house. I peeked through the curtain and saw a figure standing near the fence. Whoever it was wore a black hoodie and was staring directly at my bedroom window. I screamed. Caleb immediately ran upstairs and rushed outside, but by the time he opened the back door, nobody was there anymore. Just wet grass and the backyard gate swinging open. The next morning, the security cameras showed footage of a gray SUV parked about 50 yards away from our house for nearly 3 hours the night before. No visible license plate, no clear view of the driver. That was when I started truly panicking. Caleb wanted to contact the FBI because between the impersonation and the stalking, things had become too serious. But right then, my mother inserted herself again. She insisted we might be overreacting, saying wealthy people often become targets. Then she suggested I stay with her for a few days to rest. I agreed. The biggest mistake of my life started there. My mother's house looked exactly the same as always, thick with the suffocating smell of vanilla and cinnamon candles, family photos covering every hallway wall, all of them pictures of me as a child standing stiffly beside her awkward smile. There wasn't a single photo of my father after I turned 10 years old. I had never noticed that before. I couldn't sleep the first night there. At nearly 7 months pregnant, my back constantly ached. Around 3 a.m, I went downstairs for water and heard my mother talking on the phone outside on the back patio. At first, I was going to go back upstairs, but then I heard Caleb's name. I froze behind the kitchen door. My mother's voice was low and sharp, completely different from the sweet, gentle tone she always used around other people. "I don't care how you do it. Just stay away from my daughter." A long pause. Then she added, "If she finds out what happened back then, all of us are finished." The blood inside my body turned to ice. I accidentally dropped the glass in my hand. It shattered loudly across the kitchen floor. My mother spun around instantly, and for one split second, I saw something terrifying in her eyes. Not concern, but real fear. She rushed inside asking if I was okay, then quickly laughed and claimed she was talking to someone from the insurance company. But I knew she was lying. The next morning, while my mother was at church, I started searching. I had never gone through anyone's belongings before, but something deep inside me whispered that if I didn't do it now, I would regret it forever. I went into her bedroom, opened the desk drawers, and searched through stacks of paperwork. At first, there was nothing besides bills and insurance documents, but inside the bottom locked drawer, I found the key hidden inside her jewelry box. Inside was a bundle of old letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Every single one was addressed to my mother from my father. I opened the first letter and nearly stopped breathing. "Diane, please let me see the little girl. I know Rachel isn't biologically mine, but I've raised her since birth. I can't lose her." I read that sentence over and over at least 10 times. Rachel isn't biologically mine. My hands shook so violently that I dropped the entire stack onto the floor. My whole childhood replayed inside my head like a distorted movie. My father wasn't my real father, and my mother had hidden that from me for almost 30 years. I kept reading in a state close to madness. Apparently, my mother had an affair with a wealthy man when she was younger. When she became pregnant with me, he disappeared. My father knew the truth but married her anyway and raised me like his own daughter. Then, after he died, my mother spent years telling me he was selfish and cruel. But inside those letters, all he did was beg to see me during the brief separation they had before his death. I started sobbing right there on my mother's bedroom floor. Everything I believed about my life began collapsing, and then I noticed one last thing hidden beneath the drawer: an old photograph. In the picture was my mother as a young woman, standing beside a man I had never seen before. But the thing that made my entire body freeze was how much that man looked like Caleb. The same pale blue eyes, the same crooked smile, and written on the back of the photograph in blue ink were the words, "Daniel Harper, the only man I ever loved." Harper. That was Caleb's family name. I sat on my mother's bedroom floor, barely able to breathe. The photograph in my hands had yellowed around the edges with age, and it felt like someone was crushing my brain from the inside. Daniel Harper. That last name hit me like a warning siren. Caleb never talked much about his father's side of the family because his dad died when he was still in high school, but I remembered his full name perfectly. Daniel Harper. I started shaking. At first, I told myself it had to be coincidence. America probably had thousands of men named Daniel Harper. But then I looked closer at the man in the photo again. The pale blue eyes were almost identical to Caleb's. The jawline, the crooked half smile. I felt sick. If the man in the photograph was Caleb's father, then what? What if he was my father too? The thought sent ice through my bones. I don't remember how long I sat there frozen until I heard my mother's car pulling into the driveway. I quickly shoved everything back into place and rushed into the living room. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought she might actually hear it. My mother walked inside carrying her church tote bag, still wearing that familiar gentle smile. But the second she saw my face, she paused very slightly. Just for a second, but enough for me to know she sensed something was wrong. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I had never hated the sound of her calm voice more than I did in that moment. I forced myself to sound normal and told her I was just tired. She stared at me for a few seconds too long before turning away to arrange flowers in a vase like nothing had happened. I could barely eat during dinner that night. My mother kept asking about Caleb, asking if he was still upset, if he had called me yet. Every time I heard my husband's name, my stomach tightened painfully. Around 10 that night, Caleb video called me. I looked at his face on the screen while my thoughts spiraled out of control. I had never noticed before how much his eyes resembled the man in the photograph. Caleb asked why I looked so pale. I almost burst into tears right then, but I said nothing. I couldn't. Because if that possibility was real, I didn't know how I would survive it. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the shadows of tree branches moving outside the window, replaying everything in my mind. The strange way Caleb's mother looked at mine during the wedding. The moment my mother asked Caleb what year he was born, and then went strangely quiet afterward. The way she disliked him almost immediately, without any clear reason. At 3 in the morning, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I started searching Daniel Harper online. Hundreds of results appeared, but eventually I found an old obituary for Caleb's father. My heart nearly stopped. It was him, the man from the photograph. I burst into tears out loud. It felt like the entire world around me collapsed. I stared at the dates in the obituary. Daniel Harper had died 14 years earlier in a boating accident off the coast of Florida. In the family photo attached to the article, he stood beside his wife and a teenage boy, who was unmistakably Caleb. My shaking fingers scrolled lower. Then I saw one sentence. Daniel Harper is survived by his only son. His only son. I didn't know whether I felt relieved or even more horrified. If the obituary was true, then Daniel wasn't my father. But then why did my mother keep his photograph hidden away? Why did my father write that Rachel wasn't biologically his? And most importantly, who was my real father? The questions drove me nearly insane. The next morning, I decided to confront my mother. I remember she was watering plants on the back porch. Sunlight hit her hair in a way that made everything look falsely peaceful. I held the photograph directly in front of her face. My mother froze. It was the first time in my entire life I had ever seen genuine fear in her eyes. "Where did you find that?" she asked immediately. I asked her who Daniel Harper was. She stayed silent for a long time. Then she slowly sat down in a chair, like someone whose strength had suddenly disappeared. I had never seen her look like that before. No control, no fake sweetness, just an aging woman desperately trying to protect the final secret she still had left. She told me Daniel was the man she loved before marrying my father. I asked if he was my father. She answered no so quickly that it only made me more suspicious. Then I asked why my father wrote that I wasn't biologically his. And suddenly my mother started crying. Not the soft crying she used to manipulate people. This time it sounded real. Her shoulders shook violently. She explained that before marrying my father, she briefly had a relationship with another man. When she found out she was pregnant, she wasn't certain who the father was. My father knew the truth, but married her anyway. After I was born, they decided not to do a DNA test because he loved me as his own daughter. I listened while my entire body went numb. For 28 years, I had lived inside a family built on secrets without ever knowing it. But then I realized something even worse. "If you weren't sure who my father was," I said slowly, "then how do you know Caleb and I aren't related?" My mother looked at me, and in that exact moment, I knew she was lying about something. Just 1 second. But I knew. I had spent my whole life studying her expressions to survive her moods. I recognized it instantly. "Tell me the truth." My mother stood up too quickly. "What kind of sick thing are you even thinking, Rachel?" Her voice turned so sharp that I flinched. I started crying. I asked her if she understood this would destroy my entire life if it were true. She kept insisting it was impossible, saying I was overly emotional because of the pregnancy. But she couldn't look me in the eyes even once. Right then, my phone rang. It was Caleb. I stepped outside to answer because I didn't want my mother hearing the conversation. But the second I heard Caleb's voice, my stomach dropped. "Rachel," he said quietly, "the police just came to my office." I asked him what happened. He went silent for a few seconds before saying, "That SUV parked near our house the other night, it was rented under your mother's name." I felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. Caleb explained that police traced the license plate through a rental company in Charleston. The driver's license used for the rental belonged to my mother. I slowly turned and looked at her through the kitchen window. She was standing inside, staring directly at me. No emotion, no panic, just watching me like she was waiting to see how much I already knew. Then Caleb said something else that made the blood inside my body freeze. "Rachel, there's one more thing." I asked what. His voice lowered. The woman from the hotel photos? I recognized her. My heart started pounding violently. She used to be your mother's best friend. I don't remember exactly how I ended the call with Caleb. I only remember how ice cold my hands felt and how violently my heart pounded against my chest. Through the kitchen window, my mother was still standing there watching me. The familiar softness was gone from her face. The look in her eyes reminded me of being a child after accidentally breaking a glass and seeing her go quiet for a few minutes before saying the kinds of things that made me feel like the worst little girl in the world. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't 10 years old anymore. I walked back into the house. Why did you rent that SUV? My mother didn't answer immediately. She turned away and poured herself water like the question meant nothing. I noticed her hand trembling slightly. Rachel, I think you should go back home to your husband. Stop changing the subject. It was the first time in my life I had ever yelled at her. My mother froze. I asked again. Why was her name attached to the rental records? Why was the woman in the hotel photos her old friend? Why had someone impersonated Caleb and died in that car crash? Why had she lied to me my entire life? The air in the kitchen felt thick enough to suffocate us both. Then my mother laughed quietly. That laugh made my scalp tingle because it was so familiar. Every time she felt herself losing control, she laughed like that to calm herself down. You think I want to hurt you? I don't know what you want anymore. It was the first time I had ever called her you instead of Mom, and she noticed instantly. Her face changed immediately. She slammed the glass down on the counter and stared at me with a mixture of hurt and anger. After everything I've done for you. That sentence, the sentence I had heard for nearly 30 years. After everything I've done for you. I heard it when I gave up my scholarship. When I stopped seeing friends because she disliked them. When I moved closer after getting married. When I apologized just to keep peace. But this time, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty anymore. I just felt tired. I'm going home. My mother's tone changed instantly. Rachel, it's not safe out there. I think this is the unsafe place. I turned and walked straight toward the door. She didn't stop me. But just as I opened the car door, she called out something that made me freeze in place. If you knew who Caleb really is, you wouldn't go back to him. I turned around immediately, but my mother only stood there on the porch staring at me with an expression I couldn't fully understand. Part pity, part fear, and part hatred. During the drive back to Charleston, my thoughts became so chaotic I nearly crashed twice. I didn't know who to believe anymore. Caleb had always tried to protect me, but my mother had never directly done anything that proved she wanted to hurt me. And the SUV rental under her name could have been forged. I tried desperately to hold on to that logic. Until I got home. The front door was slightly open, the living room lights were on, and Caleb wasn't answering his phone. I ran inside in panic. Caleb? No answer. I stepped into the living room and nearly froze. Everything had been torn apart. Drawers dumped across the floor, broken glass everywhere, files and papers ripped into pieces. My heart started pounding wildly. Then I heard a faint noise upstairs. I grabbed a broken decorative lamp from the floor and slowly climbed the stairs. Every step felt impossibly heavy. My mind imagined every horrifying possibility. But when I pushed open the bedroom door, I saw Caleb sitting on the floor. His shirt was stained with blood, one eye swollen purple. I screamed and ran toward him. He immediately wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "I'm okay." I started crying instantly. Caleb explained that about an hour earlier, 2 masked men had broken into the house. They didn't steal money or electronics. They only searched through paperwork and beat him when he tried to stop them. Before leaving, one of them said, "You should have stayed away from the girl a long time ago." Police arrived afterward but found almost nothing except shoe prints and destroyed security cameras. That night, I couldn't sleep. Caleb lay beside me with ice pressed against his eye while I stared at the ceiling until dawn. Around 4 in the morning, he suddenly spoke. "Rachel, I think this is connected to my father." I turned toward him, and for the first time, Caleb told me the family secret he had hidden for years. Before his death, Daniel Harper had worked for a massive investment company in Florida. But about 2 years before he died, he suddenly quit his job and became increasingly paranoid. He drank heavily, fought constantly with Caleb's mother, and once told Caleb, "If anything ever happens to me, don't trust anyone." A month before his death, he started receiving threatening phone calls. Then one night, he took his boat out alone and never came back. Police ruled it an alcohol-related boating accident, but Caleb never believed it. Listening to him sent chills through my body. Everything was beginning to connect into something even darker than I imagined. The next morning, Caleb took me to meet the woman from the hotel photos. Her name was Monica Green. She was around 50, with short, dark hair and exhausted eyes. She lived in a small apartment in Savannah, and the moment she saw me, her face turned pale. "I knew sooner or later the girl would find out," she murmured. We sat inside a tiny kitchen that smelled like old coffee. Caleb held my hand the entire time. And then Monica told us the truth. She used to be my mother's best friend when they were young. They grew up together in Florida. According to Monica, my mother had been beautiful when she was younger and completely obsessed with money. She constantly said she would never live poor like her own mother did. When she met Daniel Harper, she became fixated on him because he was wealthy, charming, and came from a respected family. But Daniel was in love with another woman. Monica said my mother couldn't accept that. She started following Daniel around for months. At one point, she even faked a pregnancy trying to force him into marriage. When that failed, she met my adoptive father only a few weeks later. I sat there frozen. But Monica wasn't finished. About 8 months earlier, my mother suddenly contacted her again. She wanted Monica to approach Caleb, to make it look like he was cheating, to destroy our marriage. My stomach twisted painfully. "Why?" I asked. Monica stared at me for a long time. Then she said the sentence that turned my blood cold. "Because your mother believes Caleb has been investigating his father's death." I turned toward Caleb. He stayed silent, which meant he had known something and hidden it from me. I asked him what was really happening. Caleb lowered his head for a few seconds before exhaling deeply. And that was when he said the words that completely shattered my world. "Rachel, a few months ago, I discovered that my father and your mother were connected to a missing person case." I didn't understand. "A girl disappeared in 1995. My heart slammed against my ribs. Caleb continued, "And that girl was your biological sister." I looked at Caleb like he had just spoken a different language. "What?" My voice barely came out. Caleb sat silently for several long seconds before opening the old briefcase beside his feet. He pulled out a worn folder with bent corners. I noticed his hands were shaking too. "I was going to tell you after I was more certain," he said quietly, "but things have gone too far now." I opened the folder. The first page was a photograph of a girl around 17 years old, with long brown hair and eyes that looked terrifyingly similar to mine. Not normal similarity, the kind that instantly tells you there's blood connection. Her name was Hannah Cole, missing during the summer of 1995 in Jacksonville, Florida. Last seen leaving home with an unidentified blonde woman. My entire body went numb. That's impossible. Caleb explained that about 4 months earlier, while reviewing old files connected to his father's former company, he discovered my mother's name mentioned in several old investigation records from Florida. At first, he thought it was coincidence, but then he found Hannah's picture, and she looked too much like me. I turned another page. According to the old report, Hannah had lived with a single mother and a baby sister before disappearing. Not long after the disappearance, the mother died by suicide. The baby sister was never found. I suddenly couldn't breathe. "I think..." Caleb paused for several seconds. "I think you're that baby." The entire room fell silent. It felt like my mind had split in half. For 28 years, I believed I was my mother's only daughter, and now there was a possibility I had been taken from another family entirely. I started crying. Not loud sobbing, just tears falling automatically because my brain couldn't process anymore. Caleb wrapped his arms around me, but I barely felt it. Everything suddenly replayed inside my head, like pieces of some sick puzzle. There were no pictures of my mother pregnant with me, no hospital photos after I was born. Every time I asked questions about my early childhood, my mother changed the subject. I remembered asking once as a kid why my blood type didn't match either of my parents. My mother became so furious, she smashed a glass in the kitchen. At the time, I thought she was just stressed. Now it felt horrifying. I asked Caleb why he hadn't told me sooner. He looked at me with genuine pain in his eyes. Because I didn't want to destroy your life if I was wrong. Right then, my phone rang. Mom. My whole body stiffened when I saw her name appear on the screen. I didn't want to answer, but eventually I did. My mother's voice sounded calm. Too calm. Where are you? I didn't answer. She continued. Rachel, I know what Caleb told you. The blood inside my body turned cold. How do you know? My mother laughed softly through the phone. Because I understand him better than you think. I started trembling. I asked her who Hannah was. There was silence for several seconds on the other end. Then my mother said something that made my heart nearly stop. He didn't tell you who Hannah's real father was? I looked at Caleb. His face had gone pale. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact your husband isn't as innocent as you think. Her voice sounded completely different now. No more pretending to be the wounded mother. It was sharp, cold, like a blade. Everything Caleb did from the beginning wasn't because he loved you. I screamed at her to stop talking, but she kept going. I warned you already, Rachel. The Harper family is full of liars. Then she hung up. I turned toward Caleb immediately. What else do you know? Caleb closed his eyes for a few seconds, and in that exact moment, I realized my mother had hit something real. There was more he hadn't told me. Something huge. I slowly stepped backward away from him. Caleb. He opened his eyes, red from tears. My father, he spoke slowly, was once suspected in Hannah's disappearance. The room exploded inside my head. I couldn't hear anything except thick ringing in my ears. Caleb quickly explained his father had never been charged because there wasn't enough evidence. But according to old police files, Daniel Harper had been in contact with Hannah's biological mother only weeks before Hannah vanished. I started truly panicking. I didn't know who to trust anymore. My mother might be a pathological liar, but Caleb's family was hiding something horrifying too. I ran into the bathroom and threw up immediately. When I looked up at myself in the mirror afterward, I barely recognized my own face. I remembered my mother once telling me as a child, "You have the eyes of someone I hate." At the time, I thought she meant my father. Now I wasn't sure anymore. About an hour later, Caleb received a call from Charleston police. The SUV rented under my mother's name had been found abandoned near the marina. There was blood inside the vehicle, and in the trunk was an unregistered handgun. But the thing that stunned everyone was the paperwork found inside the glove compartment. An old investigation file about Hannah Cole, with handwritten notes in the margins from my mother that read, "She's starting to suspect." I nearly collapsed onto the floor. Police requested to speak with my mother immediately, but when they arrived at her house, she was gone. Her phone was turned off. Her car was still parked outside. Nobody knew where she went. That night, heavy rain pounded against the city. I sat on the living room couch holding my pregnant stomach, emotionally numb. Caleb paced back and forth nonstop, making calls to police. Outside the windows, lightning flashed white across the sky. Then the doorbell rang. Both Caleb and I jumped. He opened the door, and the second he saw who was standing outside, his face turned completely white. It was his mother, Linda Harper, a woman I had only met a few times during our marriage. She stepped inside wearing a soaked black raincoat and looked directly at me. Her eyes were swollen red like she had been crying for hours. And the first thing she said was, "Rachel, your mother wasn't the only person who killed someone." The air in the living room froze the moment Linda Harper said those words. Outside, rain still poured endlessly. Water streamed down the windows while distant thunder rolled across the sky, making everything feel like some cheap Netflix nightmare. But the pain inside my chest at that moment felt terrifyingly real. Caleb stood motionless beside the door. "Mom." I had never heard him say that word like that before. Not angry, not shocked. More like someone realizing the thing they feared their entire life had finally happened. Linda walked slowly into the living room and removed her rain hood. She looked much older than the last time I'd seen her a few months earlier. Deep shadows under her eyes, gray hair visible at her roots. She stared at me for a very long time. Then she started crying. "I'm sorry. I almost laughed because my mind had reached complete overload. Sorry. After all this? After the secrets, the stalking, the deaths, the disappearances, the lies? I asked her what she meant. Linda sat down on the couch like a woman whose body had finally given up carrying its weight, and then she told the story buried for nearly 30 years. Hannah Cole's disappearance in the summer of 1995 wasn't random. Caleb's father, Daniel Harper, truly was involved, but not the way police believed. Linda explained that when he was younger, Daniel had affairs with many women. One of them was Hannah's biological mother. When the woman became pregnant with her second child, she threatened to expose the relationship publicly. Daniel panicked, terrified of losing both his family and his career, so he completely cut her off. Everything should have ended there, until the night Hannah disappeared. Linda said Daniel came home that evening almost out of his mind. Mud covered his clothes. His hands were scraped and bleeding. He kept repeating that it was an accident. An accident. I started shaking. According to Linda, Hannah confronted Daniel after discovering he might be the biological father of her baby sister. They argued violently near an old dock in Jacksonville. Hannah ran away in the rain, slipped, and hit her head against the rocks. Daniel panicked. He didn't call the police. He hid her body. I felt the blood inside me turn to ice. "No," I whispered. Linda broke down sobbing. She said Daniel confessed everything to her that same night. Afterward, they secretly used money and connections to bury the case. Hannah's mother completely fell apart and took her own life several months later. And the baby sister? Me. Daniel wanted to place me into the foster care system, but my mother appeared, and that was when everything became truly twisted. According to Linda, my mother had been obsessed with Daniel for years already. When she learned what happened, she used the secret to force Daniel into giving her the baby. In exchange, she promised silence forever. I could barely hear anymore, which meant my mother didn't take me because she loved me. I was a tool, a chain binding her forever to the Harper family secret. I started crying so hard I could barely breathe. My entire life, I carried this feeling that my existence itself was somehow wrong. Now I finally understood why. Because to my mother, I had never truly been her daughter. I was a trophy, proof that she still possessed some piece of the man she obsessed over. I looked at Caleb. He was crying too. But then I noticed something wrong. Very wrong. Since the moment Linda entered the house, Caleb hadn't actually looked surprised. Not like someone hearing the truth for the first time. More like someone who already knew. My heart started pounding violently. Caleb. He looked up at me, and the look in his eyes made me understand everything instantly. He knew. At least part of it. "How long have you known?" Caleb stayed silent. I repeated the question, my voice trembling uncontrollably now. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Since I was 17. The entire room collapsed around me. I stepped backward away from him immediately. He stood up quickly, trying to reach for me, but I screamed, "Don't touch me!" I could barely breathe. 11 years. He had known for 11 years. Caleb explained that after his father died, he found old journals hidden among Daniel's belongings. Inside them were partial confessions about Hannah and the missing baby. Caleb spent years trying to find me, though at the time he only knew my childhood name. Then, years later, he met me in that bookstore in Charleston.